What's up, guys? Welcome back to Newswave. Yesterday, a report was published around Nintendo and the Switch 2, and wouldn't you know it, Nintendo's doomed again. This one, though, does talk about some of the production behind the scenes for Nintendo's new system, and we'll go over what it's saying and where it's coming from exactly here today. Also, we are going to be talking about Sony as another studio is being shut down, once again putting focus on the leadership and, yes, the live service push that's been happening. And we also have Xbox now trying to figure out what they're exactly doing going into what should be a new generation here in 2027. Well, it does seem that Asha Sharma has some plans for Game Pass and even some interesting, we'll say, collaborations coming up, all of that and more. Guys, if you enjoy these videos, make sure you hit that like button, helps out a ton. And if you're new here to the Spawn Wave channel, make sure you subscribe down below. And of course, members for the channel do get Newswave early. If you would like to learn more about that, click the join button or link in the description down below. And we're gonna start today with Pokémon Champions. This is basically the new age Pokémon Stadium. And we know it's coming to Switch, Switch 2, and eventually to mobile devices with Android and iOS. Well, now we do have the release date as well as like a 6-minute overview trailer for the game. We can see this though. This is over on Nintendo Life, saying Nintendo and the Pokemon Company have announced that Pokemon Champions is coming to Switch on April 8th, 2026, with iOS and Android release following later in the year. And there will also be a free update that'll boost visuals on the newer Switch 2 system, as opposed to just the Switch 1, I guess just resolution and stuff being pushed for the newer system through backwards compatibility. So we'll see exactly how all of that lines up. But this is an interesting one because, yes, it is a free-to-play game that does have microtransactions involved. It's free to start, as they say, with optional in-game purchases, and it's going to come down to how exactly that's balanced and treated in the game. Now, it seems like the overview trailer shows you could still do a lot without having to put money into it, but as they eventually roll it out to iOS and Android, I'm sure they're expecting quite a bit of money to roll in beyond that initial wave, that free to start mantra. So we'll see how that turns out. And then, of course, the game itself. I think there's a lot of potential here for a game that focuses completely on the battling aspects of Pokemon, but I guess we'll find out more when it releases April 8th. Also, we have some interesting news here for physical game collectors, especially on the Switch 2, who have been used to seeing the game key card symbol pop up for many of these different titles. Well, now there's one game, which, I mean, you can see Mouse PI for Hire. It's getting a physical edition, which is great. It's coming later than the digital release, that, of course, happening in April next month. Well, the physical edition is going to have to be a couple of months later. That is July 10th. However, there will be a PS5 edition and a Switch 2 edition. The Switch 2 edition is $10 more than the PS5 one, all right? And we know, of course, cartridges, if they're going to put it all in the cartridge, it's going to cost them a bit more money. And check it out, they are indeed putting the entire thing on the cartridge, and it's $40. So that's throwing people through a loop right now. I mean, it is $10 more again than the PS5. We know those cartridges aren't exactly cheap. Like, it eats up quite a bit of their margin. But we've also heard about there being smaller cartridges on the way, and that was a couple of months ago. So I do wonder if this is using maybe a smaller cartridge for the Switch 2, and I'm interested enough to maybe pick the game up and open the cartridge just to see if that is the case. But I am excited for Mouse PI for Hire launching next month. I'll be checking it out right away because it does look genuinely unique and interesting with its art style and then some of the gameplay mechanics. But I guess I'll be picking it up physically here on the Switch 2, mostly for science to see what's going on there. Oh, and we got another sales update for Crimson Desert. As I was going over the patch notes, when you know what, they decided to drop an update here, a new figure. You can see 3 million copies have now sold worldwide, and the game just seems to continue along. Again, on Steam, it's more than 100,000 people are consistently playing the game at any one time, and I think it's doing pretty well on the PS5 and the Xbox, I'd assume there, as their charts don't update as transparently and as frequently as what we see on Steam through the Steam database. But still, it seems like it's doing pretty well there, and people are very receptive to a lot of the updates that have been happening with the patch notes. And I think it's just people are getting further in the game and going, oh, wow, okay, this game does actually get better. Yes, after like 7-8 hours, but it does get better. So if they stick around and kind of tough it out there, you end up with a game that I think is actually pretty awesome now. I'm closing in on 25 hours, and the game keeps opening up, and it's actually getting more and more fun as I go. So, hey, good news there for Crimson Desert and Pearl Abyss. 3 million copies sold already. And guys, with some of the quick news out of the way, let's get into the bigger stuff. Let's start right away with this new report coming from Bloomberg, and yes, it's Machizuki again. And like, he's come under fire multiple times from not only Nintendo but also Sony. Both have refuted previous reports that he's put out there, especially ones that seem to deal with productions or estimating maybe costs around different systems and what Nintendo's margin is, for example, on the OLED Switch. Here, though, Machizuki is talking about production numbers when it comes to the Switch 2 and the demand around the system, specifically in the US. Now, we can see some of the report here where he says Nintendo is cutting back the production of the Switch 2 after demand for the $450 gaming console trailed the company's expectations during the year-end holiday season, particularly in the US. The company plans to make 4 million units of its flagship device this quarter, a third less than the 6 million it had originally planned to produce. People familiar with the matter said, the reduced output rate is set to continue in April. These people asking not to be named as the figures aren't public. The successful launch of Pokémon Pocopia hasn't prompted the management to again accelerate production of the Switch 2. Instead, it's waiting to see if the hit game and other new titles have enough staying power to merit an output increase. It's important to note the output cut shouldn't affect Nintendo's ability to meet the average analyst estimate of about 20 million Switch 2 units sold in the fiscal year through this month. And the funny part about this, in October 2025, this Machizuki did report that Nintendo was raising production from 20 to 25 million by the end of March. And let's say Nintendo would have shifted 20 million by the end of this fiscal period, they still would have make more than 20 million systems because they'd be producing more now for the following quarter. So yeah, I guess you'd knock that down 2 million units then, just based on what's being said here. So let's say they ship or they're producing then after a fiscal year like 23 million with 3 million more in circulation. That's still pretty good. That's the thing that's funny about this report, because Nintendo stock took a hit. It went down like 5 or 6%. It's almost Machizuki wanted to remind Nintendo who he was, but that's the way it is with Bloomberg. That it does speak to the investors with all these different reports, and this doesn't necessarily paint the Switch 2 in a great light, because it's like, wow, there's just not a lot of demand for this system. But then you go, well, hold on, it's 20 million. So I think they're going to come up with a number. This would have been the first week of May, we'll say. They're going to come up with a number that I think is like 20.5 million systems would have shipped then by the end of March. So by next week. And I do think Pocopia was the big driving force that's going to just push them over that finish line for the forecast. But that's not even a full year. So it's 20.5 million Switch systems shipped as I think is going to happen here in 10 months, because they still have then technically April and May. Remember, it came out right at the beginning of June last year, so you don't really count June necessarily, but you got 2 more months. So I think this thing in its first year has the potential to finish right around 22.5 to 23 million systems. That's a lot for its first year for any system. And like Matt Piscatella, as an example, over on a social media account, was comparing the Switch 2 to other first years for systems in the US. And the only system is really trailing is the Game Boy Advance. At this time, it is 45% ahead of the Switch 1. The thing is, though, I think it eventually will trail the Switch 1, because the Switch 1 went on a generational run. I don't think the Switch 2 is going to end up near, say, 160 million units that it would need to pass the Switch 1 lifetime when it's all said and done. But I do think the Switch 2 will most likely be a 100 million plus unit seller. And typically that's very good. That is kind of an outlier almost for Nintendo, if you look at all of their systems from history. What this does kind of tell us, though, I will say, is Nintendo is looking at their next quarter, and you judge your production based on the previous quarter. The holiday period, I just don't think they had the big heavy hitter. They had multiple games in there, but nothing that was like, okay, this is it. Like if Pocopia had come out in November, you could have pointed at that and said, okay, there it is. That's the big holiday title for Nintendo based on reviews, based on interest and demand. Is like Kirby Air Riders doing that? Not really. Is Hyrule Warriors doing that? No. Metroid Prime 4? No. And that's kind of the issue, is they didn't really have that big, that really, really big release to catapult sales for the Switch 2. But since they'd be looking at that to then judge sales going forward here, especially to start off 2026, they have Yoshi coming up, they have Tamagotchi Life. Don't know if either of those games are Nintendo's looking at them and being like, yeah, these are each 10 million unit sellers. It's just probably not likely. Although Tamagotchi Life, I don't know, that's a Switch 1 game as well, and I think that has potential to do well. but like well over the course of the Switch 2's lifetime, not necessarily in the immediate. So I think right now the biggest thing Nintendo has to do before their investor report with investors at the beginning of May, and I think they will do this, is some kind of direct just to start setting up the rest of this year. But you know what, Nintendo, I don't think you have to be worried about announcing something that is 2 or 3 years in the future. Like, you could announce the 3D Zelda game and be like, hey, this is something we have planned for this generation. If you're more than halfway through the generation, I don't know if I would announce something like that, because then you could get in a position where it turns into a next generation game, as we've heard for things like a Donkey Kong Bonanza or a Mario Kart World, where they were working on Mario Kart World originally on the Switch 1, and then it moved over to the Switch 2. Stuff like that happens in development. If you announce a 3D Zelda game, we'll say next month for the Switch 2, yeah, I mean, even if it takes 3 years to come out, it's probably coming out on the Switch 2. So I think you can do both. Short-term releases that are announced and then they're out a few months later, but then also more long-term, you could say, promises to help drive interest in that system. It's just, to me, it makes sense. And it's something I hope Nintendo maybe looks at a bit more and goes, okay, let's show some stuff that's happening this generation. Maybe not this year, but this generation. Just work to drive interest in the Switch 2, something that needs to be done because the system isn't exactly cheap. All right, $450 starting. They either got to get the system cheaper or just get a lot more interest with heavy hit releases to drive more demand to the system. Next up, let's talk about Sony and another studio that's being shut down. This is something that's happened with Sony a lot recently, and in fact, we can see this article here. Now, this was posted by Push Square, and I picked this one out because they did have a list of all the different studios that we'll get to here in a moment since 2020 that Sony has shut down. But this is coming way of Jason Schreier saying more layoffs today. PlayStation is closing Dark Outlaw Studios, a studio formed last year by former Call of Duty lead Jason Blundell. Its previous PlayStation studio, Deviation, was shut down in 2024. Now, Deviation was being funded by PlayStation. PlayStation pulled funding from whatever they were working on. Apparently, there were issues internally there, leadership, and is a whole thing. But once Sony pulled funding from it, then Deviation kind of just dissolved eventually. They just couldn't keep the lights on, and that's kind of how it goes when you don't have backing then. But they say PlayStation is also making other cuts, including in mobile development, around 50 people laid off. So from what we've been able to gather recently around some of these layoffs and this shutdown in particular, Sony is shifting strategies, okay? So we've already heard that they are going to have more of a focus on the console and away from PC. It also seems that they're going to have less of a focus on mobile development. And I think once again, this comes back to them putting a heavy focus on the console going in to next generation with the PlayStation 6, most likely targeting holiday 2027. If we look at the list of studios here that have been shut down since 2020, you can definitely see an acceleration in 2024 with London studio Firewalk Games, Neon Koi, Bluepoint, and now Dark Outlaw Games. Even before that, obviously Pixel Opus, Japan studio, Manchester studio. I think the more recent releases, though, do fall in line with, yes, something like Bluepoint, where it was struggling with live service stuff. They couldn't figure it out, and then they just kind of ran out of time and ideas. Neon Koi, Firewalk Games, those still leaning into kind of the lives. Even London studio. A lot of this stuff coming way of just live service issues, right? And now Dark Outlaw Games, I would assume they were working on something first-person shooter live service style, and here we are now with them gone, what, a year later? I mean, they weren't even, I assume, close to shipping a game, and that's probably what it really came down to. But if that's the case, it's like, why would they have formed at all? Why would Sony have worked to put that all together a year ago if they weren't in it for the long haul? And this is why I think it comes back to a shift in leadership and strategy with Nishino calling the shots now, having something like a PlayStation 5 that is discounted specifically in Japan to try to at least get more of a foothold there in their home country at that point, but also looking around and going, you know what, maybe this live service stuff is harder than we thought, but also more of a money sink than we're necessarily willing to put forth here. So, you know, we have some that work out well, some better, I'd say, bets that are a bit more sure, like Helldivers 2 is already established. Yes, let's continue doing that. But even leveraging their Horizon franchise, and I know people go, we've had enough Horizon. Look, it has a history of selling. So it's a strong property that they have built up. Let's take a shot with that one. And the only thing that's kind of a shame is that The Last of Us Online was never able to come out. I think it would have done well, but also probably would have sucked up a lot of Naughty Dog's time, and clearly they have aspirations for more narrative-driven single-player experiences. But it's just another studio for Sony that's shut down now. And I think we're really going to look back on this time period with the PS5, that the system was haunted by live service games for first-party offerings, but it was completely held up by third-party live service games with things like Fortnite. So it's an interesting double-edged sword here that's on full display. But now I think Sony is getting their priorities in order, especially as they work towards the PlayStation 6 with console exclusives that really lean into what they're good at making, those single-player narrative-driven experiences. And in our last bit of news, let's talk about Microsoft and Game Pass, because it seems that Asha Sharma is exploring some different strategies here, some different avenues for their subscription service. This we can see is over on GameSpot, saying the information reported that one of her ambitions is to help make future consoles and products like Game Pass more enticing to a broader range of customers. To that end, the report said Sharma may look to revamp pricing models for Game Pass to offer lower priced tiers. And I mean, yeah, look, Game Pass is just out of control now. It's $30 a month for the ultimate tier. And that does seem to have to do with the idea of putting even Call of Duty in there. It's just, it got very, very expensive behind the scenes, I'm sure, to hold up a lot of these games that were in development and then also put them into this service day one. It's just going to cost more money for the end consumer, who not everyone necessarily wants to play Call of Duty, so you might look at that as a net negative for your subscription service if you're not going to play it, because that just means the price went up without offering you more of maybe what you want, okay? But in that same report, Netflix co-CEO Greg Peters said he and Sharma have kicked around ideas for how Netflix and Xbox could work together on subscription bundles, saying, quote, "You would have to do it in a way that works for the consumer and works for both companies." And frankly, I think Microsoft's still trying to figure out how to make the Game Pass bundle work for Microsoft. But what I like about Asha's thinking is it's all about how do we do more, and it's already been exciting to watch. So this is an interesting one, okay? So the idea of bundling Game Pass in the past, from what we've seen, was, oh, let's get this Fortnite thing in there. All right, cool. We'll get, yeah, you can get Ubisoft and some other classic titles in there, which is fine. EA. I get the idea of adding like value that way. The Fortnite one, kind of sketchy. I look at that and go, it doesn't really do anything for me. But if you are a Netflix subscriber now, and there are a lot of people who subscribe to Netflix, we actually ran a poll just to see where we'd be with that, with the viewing audience now. But let's say you're in Netflix and there's a little button in there that's like launch Xbox Cloud Streaming or Xbox Game Pass Streaming. You select it and it just kicks you into a menu where it's all streaming through your TV. All of a sudden, Microsoft has access to a bunch of people overnight with the subscription service for Netflix then tied in to Xbox. I don't know how that works for the financial side. That's something that I'm sure he's mentioned. Hey, we got to figure that part out. But this has potential. Even from Netflix's viewpoint, it's like, hey, if we also have it tied into where they get more of a basic Netflix experience on Game Pass, they might be inclined to come over and check us out more and then sign up for the Ultra HD Premium tier and stuff. So I see the collaboration here. It's also very one-sided, though, because Netflix has significantly more subscribers than Xbox does for Game Pass. So I don't know how they work all that out, but I do see Asha Sharma's thinking here in customer acquisition at this point. It's kind of back to basics and what they were doing previously. Get the pricing down where $10 a month for Game Pass was like, oh yeah, okay, well, that's not bad. You know, it's almost in that tier. It's definitely an impulse buy tier territory, but almost in territory of you kind of forget about it some months. You're like, oh, that's right, $10. I still have Game Pass. To now where it's like $30. Whoa, I gotta go cancel that like now. But that they gotta get back down in that territory, but then also tie it in with already well-established subscription services. So yeah, they're gonna have to go back to basics and kind of give up a lot to get more customers. But I think it's actually possible, and it's something to definitely pay attention to here, especially with this potential Netflix collaboration. And before we go to the comment of the day, we'll take a look at the poll that I posted up yesterday, where I ask, are you currently subscribed to Netflix? 52% say no, 48% say yes. So basically, I mean, it's 50-50 here, just about. But I mean, that's just Netflix. A lot of people have it, and that's what I mean. It casts a much wider net, definitely more of a general audience, and I'm sure many people who aren't necessarily into playing video games that often and are more, I guess you'd say, the passive experience viewer, like they just want to watch stuff on TV, not necessarily interact with it. But maybe there's a world where they see the Xbox or they have games kind of in their feed, and it's like, oh, it launches on Xbox cloud streaming. The question still comes down to, do they have a controller they can use? And that's still this kind of sketchy area. It's definitely a thing that's a bit of a holdup now, is the controller, because if you could, I mean, it sounds great to use your voice or your phone or other ways, things you definitely have on you that could work in this regard. I think it would work, but it's getting there. Not everyone has that Xbox controller on the coffee table, right? So how can you get them into the game without necessarily needing that all the time? That's the thing that worked best. And we'll finish up with the comment of the day, as you're seeing here. This is from Justy, who says, the Switch 1 was my first console I bought with my own money. I saved up money from birthdays and Christmases and pre-ordered it through GameStop. I was so happy when it finally came. See, you're not going to forget that. The first system you bought with your own money, for me, it was the Super Nintendo. And I actually bought it used from my cousin who got a PlayStation 1. So I got into the Super Nintendo, like I owned a Super Nintendo. Much later in that generation, I had a Genesis right away, just about, because I got that for Christmas when I was younger. And I always had, my friend had the Super Nintendo, my cousins had the Super Nintendo, and I always play Link to the Past and Mega Man X and all these games when I'd go over to their houses. But then finally, when I saved it, I think it was $80 back then. I got it used with some games, including Link to the Past, which is awesome. And I remember having that system, and it was incredible. Like Mario, I went through and figured out all the secrets of Mario World. It was great, and it led me, of course, into things like Mega Man X. There was a solid 2 years where I just rented Super Nintendo games every weekend that I was allowed to, and I went through like the entire library. It was great. And then eventually got the N64 and moved on to the GameCube, where I finally caught up. I got that right at the beginning of the generation, and it was great too. But yeah, again, I never forget that first system that I bought with my own money, the Super Nintendo. I'm sure there are many people, their first system that they bought with their own money was the Switch 1. And ladies and gentlemen, that's going to do it here for Newswave. If you enjoyed this video, guys, hit that like button. If not, hit the dislike. Leave comments down below about everything we talked about here today. If you missed yesterday's Newswave, I'll leave it up here on a card. Or maybe you wanted to hear more about how Fortnite is faltering a bit. Epic Games definitely, as they announced a sweeping number of layoffs and a lot of questions, especially around leadership and the future for that company. I'll leave that in a video right below. Thanks, guys, for watching, and I'll see you next time.